Hello again, 122. To conclude chapter 27, we'll go over some of the changes in China when Deng Xiaoping was in the leadership of the People's Republic of China. And we'll go into a little bit into the 21st century, a little bit beyond what it says on the syllabus. And Mao Zedong died in September 1976 at the age of 83. And after a short but bitter succession struggle, the pragmatists, led by Deng Xiaoping, seized power from the radicals, the Gang of Four, led by Mao's wife, and formally brought the Cultural Revolution to an end. The egalitarian policies of the previous decade were reversed, and a new program emphasizing economic modernization was introduced. And under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, who placed his supporters in key positions throughout the party and the government, attention was focused on what were called the four modernizations: industry, agriculture, technology, and national defense. Many of the restrictions against private activities and profit incentives were eliminated, and people were encouraged to work hard to benefit themselves and Chinese society. The familiar slogan, "Serve the people," was replaced by a new one repugnant to the tenets of Mao Zedong thought: create wealth for the people. By adopting this pragmatic approach, in the Chinese aphorism, "cross the rivers by feeling the stones." In the years after 1976, China made great strides in ending its chronic problems of poverty and underdevelopment. Per capita income roughly doubled during the 1980s, and housing, education, and sanitation improved, and both agricultural and industrial output skyrocketed. Critics, both Chinese and foreign, complained that Deng Xiaoping's program had failed to achieve a fifth modernization, democracy. And in the late 1970s, ordinary citizens pasted big character posters criticizing the abuses of the past on the so-called Democracy Wall near Tiananmen Square in downtown Beijing. But it soon became clear that the new leaders would not tolerate any direct criticism of the Communist Party or of Marxist-Leninist ideology. Dissidents were suppressed, and many were sentenced to long prison terms. And then there was the incident at Tiananmen Square. And here you have a nice photo from Mr. Duker of the students protesting. And in the late 1980s, an overheated economy had led to rising inflation and growing discontent among salaried workers, especially in the cities. At the same time, corruption, nepotism, and favored treatment for senior officials and party members were provoking increasing criticism. In May 1989, student protesters carrying placards demanding science and democracy, an end to official corruption, and the resignation of China's aging party leadership. These demands received widespread support from the urban population, although notably less in rural areas, and this led to the massive demonstrations in Tiananmen Square. And the demonstrations divided Chinese leaders. Reformist elements around Party General Secretary Zhao Ziyang were sympathetic to the protesters, but veteran leaders like Deng Xiaoping saw student demands for more democracy as a disguised call for an end to the Chinese Communist Party rule. And on page 722 in the 7th edition, there are some nice opposing viewpoints on this argument over a more democratic society. Page 722 in the 7th edition. After some hesitation, the government sent tanks and troops into Tiananmen Square to crush the demonstrators. Dissidents were arrested, and the regime once again began to stress ideological purity and socialist values. Although the crackdown came under widespread criticism abroad, Chinese leaders insisted that economic reforms could only take place under conditions of party leadership and political stability. Deng Xiaoping and other aging party leaders turned to the army to protect their base of power and to suppress what they described as counter-revolutionary elements. Deng was undoubtedly counting on the fact that many Chinese, particularly in the rural areas, feared a recurrence of the disorder of the Cultural Revolution and craved economic prosperity more than political reform. in the months after troops and tanks rolled into Tiananmen Square to crush the demonstrations. The government issued new regulations requiring courses on Marxist-Leninist ideology in the schools. They suppressed dissidents within the intellectual community and made it clear that while economic reforms would continue, the Chinese Communist Party would not be allowed to lose its monopoly on power. And that's pretty much where the Deng era ended. And we're going to do some more now, closer to our own time. Harsh punishments were imposed on those accused of undermining the communist system and supporting its enemies abroad. So in this era, are they back to Confucius? In the late 1990s, the government began to cultivate urban support by reducing the rate of inflation and guaranteeing the availability of consumer goods in great demand among the rising middle class. And under Deng Xiaoping's successor, Jiang Zemin, who occupied the position of both party chief and president of China, the government promoted rapid economic growth while cracking down harshly on political dissent. So that didn't change. But discontent in the rural areas began to increase as lagging farm incomes, high taxes, and official corruption sparked resentment in the countryside. Partly out of fear that such developments could undermine the socialist system and the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, conservative leaders attempted to curb Western influence and restore faith in Marxism-Leninism. In what may have been a tacit recognition that Marxist exhortations were no longer an effective means of enforcing social discipline, the party sought to make use of Confucianism. Ceremonies celebrating the birth of Confucius now received official sanction, and the virtues promoted by the master, such as righteousness, propriety, and filial piety, or respect for ancestors and those older than you, was widely cited as an antidote to the tide of antisocial behavior. As a further indication of its willingness to employ traditional themes to further its national interest, the Chinese government has begun to sponsor the establishment of Confucian centers in countries around the world to promote its view that Confucian humanism is destined to replace traditional religious faiths in the coming decades. That's pretty wild. In effect, Chinese leaders have tacitly conceded that Marxism is increasingly irrelevant to today's China, which responds much more forcefully to the siren call of nationalism, and in a striking departure from the precepts of Marxist internationalism, official sources in Beijing cite Confucian tradition to support their assertion that China is unique and will not follow the path of peaceful evolution, to use their term, toward a future democratic capitalist society. Wow. Unrest is growing among some of the outer regions, like in China's national minorities, in Xinjiang, where the restless Muslim peoples are observing with curiosity the emergence of independent Islamic states in Central Asia, and in Tibet, where the official policy of quelling separatist sentiment has led to the violent suppression of Tibetan culture and the influx of thousands of ethnic Chinese immigrants. In the meantime, the Falun Gong religious movement, which the government has attempted to eliminate as a potentially serious threat to its authority, is an additional indication that with the disintegration of the old Maoist utopia, the Chinese people will need more than a pallid version of Marxism-Leninism or a revived Confucianism to fill the gap. And this is the Potala Palace in Tibet, and it was a distant and reluctant appendage of the Chinese Empire during the Qin dynasty. And since the rise to power of the Communist Party in 1949, the regime in Beijing has consistently sought to integrate the region into the People's Republic of China. Resistance to Chinese rule has been widespread, and in recent years the Dalai Lama, the leading religious figure in Tibetan Buddhism, has attempted without success to persuade Chinese leaders to allow a measure of autonomy for the Tibetan people. And in 2008, massive riots by frustrated Tibetans took place in the capital city of Lhasa just before the opening of the Olympic Games in Beijing. And this is today the foremost symbol of the national and cultural aspirations of the Tibetan people. In recent years, the government has shown a growing tolerance for the public exchange of ideas, which is surfaced with the proliferation of bookstores, avant-garde theater, experimental arts exhibits, and the internet. More people surf the net there than anywhere but the United States, and Chinese. And at the Communist Party's 17th Congress in 2007, President Hu insisted that the Communist Party must remain the sole political force in charge of carrying out the revolution. Ever fearful of chaos, party leaders are convinced that only a firm hand at the tiller can keep the ship of state from crashing onto the rocks. So that's the big political question going forward. How much longer can the Communist Party maintain its monopoly on political control? And this is the People's Republic today. And you can see Xinjiang. It's close to all the Muslim republics. And these are disputed areas between India and China. And here's Tibet. And that concludes chapter 27.